You are standing on a low bluff on the coast of Kyushu in the far southwest of Japan, and the wind is coming in off the water the way it always does at this hour, cool and salt-heavy, carrying the smell of the tide. You have stood this watch 100 mornings. You know this sea. You know the little fishing boats that go out before dawn and the gulls and the gray line where the water meets the sky. And this morning the gray line is wrong. You squint. You tell yourself it is a bank of low cloud or a trick of the light on the swell. But it does not move like cloud. It is too even, too toothed, too deliberate. And slowly, the way a nightmare arrives, your eye learns to read what it is looking at. Those are not waves. Those are not clouds. Those are sails, masts, hulls, hundreds of them, more than you have words to count, filling the horizon from one edge of your sight to the other, a forest of ships where there has never in your life been anything but open sea, and they are all pointed, without any doubt at all, at you. You are a fisherman's son with a spear and a horn, and coming toward your coast is the largest empire the world has ever known. So you lift the horn to your lips and you blow, and you start to run because someone has to tell them. Someone has to tell all of Japan that the end of the world has just appeared on the water. Hello, my name's Aiden, and I need to say something honest before I tell you this one, because it's a story that gets told badly more often than almost any other in Japanese history. I'm not Japanese. I'm a Westerner who fell for this country years ago and never really got up again. I spent a stretch of my life living in Kyoto, mangling the language, getting quietly and kindly corrected by people far more patient than I deserved, and slowly falling in love with a history that is not my own, and that I will spend the rest of my life trying to understand. And of all the stories I carried home from that country, this is the one that unsettles me most, because it's a story with a miracle in it, a genuine, spine-tingling, too-good-to-be-true miracle, and I want to walk you right up to that miracle and let you feel the full weight of it. And then I want us to look, together and honestly, at what was really going on underneath. Not to spoil the wonder, to understand it. Because what a people decides to believe about a moment like this one, what story it tells itself afterward, can shape that nation for centuries in ways beautiful and terrible both. So stay with me. This one goes somewhere. Here is the version you may already know. The version carved into the national memory, painted on screens, whispered as proof that this land was watched over by something greater than men. Twice, the story goes, the mightiest military machine on earth came to swallow Japan. Twice, a fleet so vast it darkened the sea arrived on these shores, carrying tens of thousands of hardened warriors who had crushed everything in their path from the plains of China to the gates of Europe. And twice, at the very edge of disaster, when the defenders were outnumbered and exhausted and all but beaten, the sky turned black, the sea rose up, and a monstrous storm came howling out of nowhere and smashed the invasion fleet to splinters. The gods themselves, so the story says, sent a wind to save their sacred islands. And they gave that wind a name that would echo for 700 years. Kamikaze, the divine wind. It's a magnificent story. It really is. And like all the best legends, it grew up around something that genuinely happened. There truly was an invasion, two of them. There truly were storms. Japan truly was saved. But the tidy, glowing shape of the legend, the gods reaching down at the perfect moment to shield a chosen people, that shape was built afterward, carefully, and it left a great deal out. And the things it left out are, to me, even more extraordinary than the miracle. So let's take the legend apart gently and see what was actually standing on that beach. To understand what Japan was facing, you have to understand the man who wanted it. His name was Kublai Khan, and he was the grandson of Genghis Khan, the grandson of the man who had built, out of horsemen and terror and astonishing organization, the largest contiguous land empire in human history. By the time our story opens, in the second half of the 13th century, Kublai ruled an empire that stretched across a breathtaking sweep of Asia. He had conquered, or was in the middle of conquering, China itself, and he founded a Chinese dynasty to rule it, the Yuan dynasty, with its capital near modern Beijing. He had subdued Korea, whose kingdom now served him, and would build and crew his ships. He was, by any measure the age could offer, the single most powerful person alive, and he looked across a narrow stretch of sea at a small chain of islands off the coast of his new domain, Japan, and he did what his family always did. He sent word that they should submit. The letters came, carried by envoys, and their tone was the courteous, iron tone of a man who is not used to being refused. He addressed the ruler of Japan, in effect, as a lesser king who would be wise to acknowledge a greater one, to send tribute to bow, to become one more thread in the vast web of the Mongol world. And in return, the implication hung there, unspoken and perfectly clear. Refuse, and you will learn what happened to everyone else who refused. Now, who was on the other end of those letters? This is where I have to gently adjust another common picture, because a lot of people imagine an emperor making this decision. But by this point in Japanese history, real power did not sit with the emperor, who was a revered and largely ceremonial figure. It sat with the warrior government based in the eastern city of Kamakura, the shogunate, and more precisely, with a family called the Hojo, who governed as regents behind the shogun. And the man who held that power when the letters arrived was young. His name was Hojo Tokimune, and he was, by our reckoning, still in his early 20s when he became the regent, the shikin, steering the whole warrior state. Think about that for a moment. A man barely out of his youth, holding the reins of a fractious military government, receives a letter from the most powerful empire on the planet demanding that his country kneel. And he says no. Not once. Again and again, as the envoys keep coming, he refuses even to negotiate. In some tellings, the shogunate simply sent the envoys away. In the harder tellings, later envoys were executed, a flat, deliberate insult that slammed every door to diplomacy. Now, I want to be careful here, because the sources for exactly what was said, and exactly why, are thin and were written by people with their own reasons, and historians argue over how much of the young regent's steel is real and how much was polished up later. But the outcome is not in doubt. Japan refused to submit, and so Kublai Khan resolved to do to these islands what he had done to everyone else. He would come and take them by force. The first blow fell in the year 1274. Historians call it the Bunei Invasion, after the Japanese era name of the time. A fleet sailed from Korea, Mongol, Chinese, and Korean troops together, crammed into hundreds of ships, and the first places to feel it were two small islands lying in the water between the mainland and Japan, right in the invasion's path. Tsushima first, then Iki. I'm not going to dress up what happened on those islands, because it was not a battle so much as an erasure, and the people who lived through it deserve to be remembered honestly rather than skipped over. The local warriors who met the invaders on the beaches were vastly outnumbered and fought and died almost to a man. And then the island's communities, ordinary families, fisherfolk, farmers, bore the full, merciless weight of a 13th century army that had come to make an example. The accounts that come down to us are full of horror, and I'll leave the details there because I don't think you need them spelled out to feel it. Tsushima and Iki were overrun. Word of it raced ahead across the water to Kyushu, and it carried a single message: these people are not coming to bargain. Then the fleet crossed to the main island of Kyushu and pushed into Hakata Bay, the water off the city we now call Fukuoka. And here, on the beaches, the samurai were waiting. Now, the samurai of this period were formidable men, but they had been shaped by a particular kind of war, a war among themselves, governed by a certain etiquette, where a mounted warrior might ride forward, announce his name and lineage in a loud voice, and challenge a worthy opponent to single combat. Honor, reputation, the individual duel. That was the war they knew. And that was not, at all, the war that stepped off those ships. The Mongols and their armies fought as a machine. They came in tight, disciplined blocks, moving on command, loosing arrows in coordinated volleys rather than seeking single combat. They used the sound of the battlefield as a weapon, massed drums and clashing gongs that reportedly panicked the samurai's horses and rattled men who had never heard anything like it. And there is a detail here that the archaeology has since helped confirm, which I find genuinely startling for the 13th century. They appear to have used early gunpowder weapons, ceramic bombs packed with powder that could be thrown or flung to burst with a flash and a roar. The Japanese sources describe them. They seem to have been called tetsuhao. Imagine facing, for the very first time, a weapon that explodes the noise, the smoke, the sheer wrongness of it, to a warrior raised on the bow and the blade. A samurai riding out alone to announce his name in the old honorable way would have found himself shot down by a dozen arrows from a formation that had no interest whatsoever in his lineage. It was, for the defenders, a brutal education. They fought hard, let no one tell you the samurai did not fight, but they were pushed back and the day went badly, and as night fell the situation on the beaches of Hakata looked grim. And then, in the morning, the invaders were gone. The fleet had pulled back. The ships that had darkened the bay had withdrawn out to sea. And then, at some point, a storm caught them, and the fleet took losses on the water before turning back toward Korea. The first invasion was over. Japan, bloodied and shaken, had survived. But here I have to plant a flag, because this is where legend and evidence start to pull apart, and I promised you honesty over a good story. That first storm, in 1274, is far less certain than the legend suggests. The reasons the invaders withdrew are genuinely debated by historians. Some point to the storm, but others point to hard, practical things. That the landing force had used up its arrows and supplies. That it may only ever have been a probe rather than a full conquest. That commanders looking at a fortified, furious enemy and a coming change in weather made the sober decision to leave while they still could. The tidy image of a divine wind arriving to sweep away a beaten enemy fits the first invasion far less cleanly than people remember. Something happened out there on the water, but a storm finished them off is already doing more work than the sources really support. Hold on to that. It matters for what comes next, because the Japanese did not sit back and thank the gods and assume it was over. And this, honestly, is the part of the story I most want you to carry away, because it's the part the legend of the divine wind quietly erases. They knew Kublai would come again. And so, in the years after 1274, the warriors of Kyushu did something that tells you everything about how seriously they took the threat, and how little they intended to leave to heaven. They built a wall. Along the shore of Hakata Bay beginning around 1276, they raised a defensive stone barrier, the Genko Borui, sometimes called the Sekurui, the stone rampart. It ran for something like 20 kilometers around the vulnerable coastline and stood roughly 2 meters high, faced with stone, built by the labor and at the cost of the local domains, who were assigned stretches to construct and maintain. It was high enough to stop a cavalry charge coming off the beach, and it gave the defenders a line to hold and a height to shoot from. Think about what that wall represents. It is the opposite of waiting for a miracle. It is a whole society, having survived one catastrophe, soberly organizing itself, quarrying stone, mustering men, dividing the labor, and physically fortifying the exact beach where the enemy would have to land, against the near certainty that the catastrophe was coming back. When the storm gets all the credit, this wall gets forgotten, and the men who built it and who would soon fight and die on it deserve a great deal better than to be a footnote to the weather, and the catastrophe did come back. In the year 1281, the Khon invasion, Kublai Khan returned, and this time he was not probing. This time he meant to end it. By now he had completed his conquest of southern China, which gave him something he had not fully had before, a vast pool of ships, sailors, and soldiers from the conquered south. And so the second invasion was built around 2 enormous fleets, coming from 2 directions to converge on Kyushu. The first was the Eastern Route Army, sailing from Korea, much as before. The second was far larger, a great southern fleet, assembling in the newly conquered lands of southern China, carrying a huge army toward the same shore. Together, the chronicles give numbers that are almost impossible to picture. Thousands of ships. In the traditional accounts, something on the order of 4,000 vessels, and well over 100,000 men. Figures that, if you take them at face value, would make this one of the largest seaborne invasion forces assembled anywhere on Earth before the 20th century. Before the beaches of the modern age, nothing on the water was supposed to be bigger than this. But you knew about was coming, because I keep making you these promises. I have to flag those numbers hard. Many modern historians are deeply skeptical of them. It was extremely common for chroniclers of this era to inflate the size of armies, to make a victory more miraculous or a foe more terrible. The historian Thomas Conlan, whose work has really reshaped how this whole episode is understood, has argued that the figures may be exaggerated by as much as an order of magnitude, that the real force, while still very large and very dangerous, may have been a fraction of the legendary count. So when I say the largest invasion before modern times, hear the asterisk in my voice. The true scale is genuinely uncertain and genuinely argued over. What is not in doubt is that it was enormous, and that it was coming, and that Japan knew it. And when it arrived, something happened that the legend almost entirely leaves out. The Japanese held. This was not a case of a doomed defense clinging on for a day until the sky saved them. The fighting in 1281 went on for weeks, and that wall the defenders had spent years building did exactly what it was built to do. The invaders, arriving in Hakata Bay, found that they could not simply pour ashore. The old, easy landing beach was now a fortified line, held by determined, waiting samurai who had learned hard lessons the first time. Attempts to land were bloodily repulsed. Denied their foothold, much of the great fleet was forced to stay out on the water, crowded together, unable to break through. And then the samurai did something I love because it turns the whole image of the stiff, honor-bound warrior on its head. They went on the offensive at sea at night in small boats. Little raiding parties rowed out under cover of darkness to the anchored enemy ships, swarmed aboard, fought hand to hand in the dark, set fires and slipped away. They harried a fleet 100 times their size with mosquito bites in the night. For weeks, the invasion was held in a kind of bloody deadlock, pinned against a coast it could not take, worn down by a defense that would not break. The men of Japan were not waiting to be rescued. They were, against staggering odds, winning time. And there was a second problem eating at the invaders from the inside, one that had nothing to do with Japanese swords. The two great fleets were supposed to meet and strike together, one overwhelming blow, but they did not arrive together, and coordinating two enormous armies, drawn from different conquered peoples, speaking different languages, sailing from different directions across open sea, turned out to be nearly impossible. There were delays. There was disease breaking out on crowded ships in the summer heat, where tens of thousands of men were packed together for weeks with bad water and worse sanitation. There was, by many accounts, friction and mistrust among the invaders themselves, so the force that was meant to fall on Japan as a single hammer instead arrived piecemeal, sat stalled off a hostile coast, and began to rot from within while the defenders picked at its edges. It was already a campaign in real trouble, and it was into that trouble, not into a fresh, confident, unbeaten armada, that the wind was about to blow. And then into that deadlock in the height of summer came the wind. This is the storm the legend was really built on, and this one the evidence supports far better. A massive typhoon, a great seasonal cyclone of the kind that still batters that coast every year, swept in off the sea and fell upon the invasion fleet where it lay, crowded and exposed, unable to scatter to safe harbor because the shore was held against it. For ships packed together at anchor in shallow coastal water, a typhoon is very nearly the worst thing in the world. The wind drives them against each other and onto the rocks. The sea heaves them up and smashes them down. And that is, as far as we can tell, precisely what happened. An enormous part of the great fleet was destroyed, hulls shattered, men drowned, the invasion's back broken in a matter of hours. Those who survived the storm and struggled ashore were hunted down. Those who could still sail limped home in ruin. The second invasion, like the first, was over. And this time, Kublai Khan would never manage to mount a third. Japan had survived the mightiest empire on earth, not once but twice. You can see, can't you, how a people would look at that and see the hand of heaven. Twice the end of the world sailed to their shores, and twice the sea itself rose up and swept it away. If you had lived through it, if you had stood on that wall with a spear, certain you were about to die, and then watched the sky turn and the enemy fleet torn apart before your eyes, how could you not fall to your knees and believe the gods had reached down to save you? I don't think I could have resisted it either. And so the name was born. Kamikaze, the divine wind. Not, I should say, quite in the tidy way we picture it. The idea and the language of a heaven-sent wind protecting Japan grew and hardened over the centuries that followed, layered on afterward as the story was told and retold. But its root is right here in these two storms. A nation began to understand itself as a sacred land that the gods would not permit to fall. Now here is the turn. Here is where, 700 years later, we get to do something the people on that beach never could. We get to go down and look, off the coast of a place called Takashima, in Imuri Bay. Divers and archaeologists have spent decades excavating the seabed, where much of that second fleet went down. It is the first underwater site in Japan to be designated a National Historic Site, and what has come up out of the mud is astonishing. Timbers, anchors, weapons, personal belongings, even those ceramic Tetsuhou bombs, still holding their shape after 7 centuries under the sea. It is a drowned battlefield, and it has been quietly telling a more complicated story than the legend ever did. Because when the archaeologists looked closely at the wrecked ships, they did not find the flawless armada of the myth. They found evidence of haste, and of shortcuts, and of shoddy work. The anchors are a small, telling example, some of them made not in the strong traditional way, with a single great stone stock, but cruder with smaller paired stones that would have held far less reliably. And more striking still, there is real evidence that many of the vessels were not proper ocean-going warships at all, but flat-bottomed river craft, boats built for the calm inland waterways of China, pressed into service and sent out onto the open, typhoon-prone sea because Kublai needed hulls, and he needed them fast, and he had just conquered a land full of river boats. Picture what that means. A huge share of the fleet that was supposed to conquer Japan may have been made of the wrong kind of boat, rushed, overloaded, poorly anchored, riding at the mercy of a sea it was never designed to face. And a typhoon came. And this is the question I have to lay out for you as honestly as I can, because it is genuinely open, and anyone who tells you it's settled is selling you a story rather than the history. How much of Japan's survival was the storm, and how much was everything else? The old legend says, the wind, just the wind, the gods. But when you add up what we now know, the wall that stopped the landings, the weeks of ferocious defense that pinned the fleet out on the water, the night raids, the confusion and poor coordination between two separate fleets that struggled to unite, and the sheer number of rushed, unseaworthy ships crowded together where the storm could reach them, the picture changes. The historian I mentioned, Thomas Cunlan, has argued pointedly that it was not really the storms that defeated the Mongols at all, but the Japanese defenders on the ground and the invasion's own disorganization, and that the wind mostly finished off a campaign that was already failing. I want to be fair to every side of this, because I'm an outsider reading across a debate carried out by people far deeper in the sources than I am. Other historians still give the typhoon a starring role, a storm that catastrophic really did destroy a large part of a real fleet, and that's not nothing. The honest answer is that it was almost certainly a combination, a determined defense that kept the enemy trapped in exactly the wrong place, a fleet weakened by haste and bad ships and divided command, and then a genuine, terrible storm that fell on all of it at the worst possible moment. The numbers are uncertain. The exact balance of causes is uncertain. What is not uncertain is that the gods sent a wind, and that leaves out the wall, and the weeks of fighting, and the men who built and held the line, and the rotten river boats. It leaves out, in other words, nearly everything human. And that's what I keep circling back to, sitting with this story late at night. Not the miracle, what the miracle became, because a people that has just survived something impossible has to make sense of it. And Japan reached for the most powerful, most comforting explanation available. We were saved because we are sacred. The gods themselves guard these islands. The divine wind will always come, and you can understand exactly why. It's a beautiful, unifying, deeply human thing to believe after you've stared down the end of the world and lived. But look at what it quietly does. It takes a survival that was mostly earned by builders and defenders and desperate men in small boats, by luck and by weather and by an enemy's own mistakes, and it hands the whole of the credit to heaven. It turns weather into destiny. It turns a near-run thing into a promise, and a promise like that can sit inside a nation for centuries, quietly waiting. Here is the part that I cannot tell this story without telling, because to leave it out would be a kind of cowardice. Almost 700 years later, in the final desperate months of the Second World War, with the Empire of Japan facing defeat and invasion, that old promise was pulled back out and put to the most terrible use imaginable. The young pilots who were sent to crash their aircraft deliberately into enemy ships, thousands of them, sent to certain death in the hope that they might be the divine wind reborn, the miracle come again to save the sacred islands one last time. They were called Kamikaze. The same word, the same promise from the 13th century, reached for again as a nation went down. A story that had once been a people's gratitude for survival became, in the end, a story used to ask its children to die. That is what a myth can grow into if it's the wrong myth, left untended for long enough. And I can't help but turn that toward us, toward you, and toward me, because we are none of us immune to it. We all do a smaller version of what Japan did. Something goes right for us, we survive something, we come through a crisis, we get lucky in a way we can barely believe, and almost immediately we start building a story about why. And the story we build is so rarely I got lucky and other people carried me and the weather happened to break my way. It's almost always something grander and more flattering. I was chosen. I earned it. I was always meant to make it. We take the wall and the friends and the river boats and the storm and we quietly erase all of it and we keep only the miracle with ourselves at the center of it. And it feels wonderful. But it costs something later. Because a person or a nation that believes it is protected by destiny stops building walls. It stops thanking the people who carried it. It starts expecting the wind to come again every time forever. And the wind does not make promises. The wind just blows. So that's what I genuinely love to hear from you, and I do read the comments. I read everyone I can. When was a time in your own life that you survived something or succeeded at something and afterward told yourself a story about why? And looking back now, honestly, was it destiny or was it really a wall you'd built and people who carried you and a storm that happened to break your way? I want to know. Tell me down below. And listen, I've stumbled through a lot of names tonight. Tsushima and Hakata and Hojo Tokimune and the rest. And somewhere my old friend Kenji is quietly wincing. Or so I'm told. My Japanese friends would wince at my pronunciation. He spent years patiently fixing my vowels and I still get them wrong. So if you know this history better than I do, and many of you will, come and correct me kindly in the comments. That's honestly how I keep learning it. There was an old monk I used to talk to during my Kyoto years who told me once that the sea gives and the sea takes, and that a wise person is grateful for the first and never forgets the second. I didn't fully understand him at the time. I think I do now. The people who survived those 2 invasions built their wall first and thanked the wind after. We tend to do it the other way around. If you want more of this, the real, human, complicated history underneath the beautiful legends of the country I can't stop loving, then subscribe and stay with me a while. There is so much more of this world I want to show you. My name's Aiden. Watch the horizon, and I'll see you in the floating world.